Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Caesar's Palace for 12 rounds of boxing. In the red corner, from Los Angeles, California, wearing the red trunks with the gold trim, weighing in at 125 pounds, the lightweight champion of the world, Danny Little Red Lopez. Well, Bill, our winners get a home theater receiver. That's right. Experience the full potential of high-definition video with this 72-channel digital home theater receiver from Yamaha. But wait, that's not all. They also get a 5.1-channel surround sound system from Mirage. With 5 palm-sized speakers and a compact subwoofer cube, the MX 5.1 brings you huge immersive sound with Mirage's omnipolar technology. All from the Spiegel catalog, Chicago, Illinois, 60609. And they're taking closer order as down the stretch they come. Mr. Hot Stuff has 3 lengths to make up with chocolate candy last. On the rail, take the points behind that gallant son with chocolate candy gaining on the outside. In the lead is Pioneer of the Nile being tackled by chocolate candy. They're neck and neck as they come to the wire. And Pioneer of the Nile holds off chocolate candy and wins the Santa Anita Derby. And now, on your feet, time to greet holder of 14 NBA titles, your home team, your Los Angeles Lakers. Number 3 at 6'8", 5th year out of UCLA, playing forward, Trevor Ariza. Starting at center, number 17 at 7 feet, 4th year out of St. Andrews High School, Andrew Bynum. And at guard, number 24, 6'6", 13th season out of Loyal Marion High School, Kobe Bryant.
I love the commercials for the age drugs. Maybe Truvada. It'd be like, this is a real upbeat commercial for a deadly disease. You never see like cancer. We're talking about cancer. Leukemia. I'm at home like, should I get AIDS? Because they having a good-ass time with this, hey? I love these commercials. They always start with a straight white guy. That's to let us know anybody can get it. Hi, I'm Corey. And I'm living with HIV. And we're at home like, Corey got it! Not Corey! Then it'll be a black woman. Now, she don't got no lines. She just got a I hope I don't have AIDS face. You know, she'll be cooking and just... Then they hit you with, you know, the target demographic. You know what I mean? Here comes Devontae. He'll be a dance class for some reason. He'll be in a prom pose with his Asian boyfriend. Truvada! When you have to have it raw.
Good morning. It's Tuesday, Trump Tuesday, March the 25th, and this is The True Conservative. Welcome to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there. I'm Ron, your host, and the only true conservative in the United States today. So today, after the Serenity Prayer and the patriotic song of the day, we will have headlines, patriotic shorts, motivation, Bishop Barron, Ayn Rand, Ayn Rand and Donald Trump. All that and more when I get back. God, grant me the serenity to accept the things I should not change, the courage to change the things I should, and the wisdom to know the difference. Amen. Thank you. And now the headlines for Tuesday, March the 25th. One person injured in shooting outside Target store in Baldwin Park. CAL FIRE releases updated maps showing SoCal wildfire risk. Firefighters had high levels of lead, mercury after LA fires. Juju Watkins suffers season-ending injury as USC advances to Sweet 16. 27-year-old father with disabilities found dead in Long Beach. Former Yankees son died of food intoxication, officials suspect. Former UFC heavyweight champion Cain Velasquez sentenced in 2022 case. Family mourns father of two killed while working on 91 freeway. And those are the headlines for Tuesday, March the 25th. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now the political corner.
I think sometimes it's important to do a little bit of reality check and take a little different spin at the numbers. I'm going to do that right here because all we talk about is how unpopular Donald Trump is. But in reality, he's basically more popular than he was at any point in term number one and more popular than he was when he won election back in November of 2024. What are we talking about? His net favorable rating right now comes in at -4 points. Compare that to where he was when he won in November of 2024 when he was at -7 points, or March of 2017 when he was at -10 points. So when you compare Trump against himself, he's actually closer to the apex than he is to the bottom of the trough. And of course, that's so important because Donald Trump, historically speaking, has had his numbers underestimated. So I think it's very important to compare him to himself to understand he's actually more popular now than he was when he won, or certainly where he was at this point back in his first term. The bottom line is Trump is more towards the ceiling than he is towards the floor.
So when you do that, it makes my knees hurt. So when you look at this compared to sort of historically, what does it tell you about the percentage of folks that think the country itself, with him at the helm, is on the right track?
This, I think, is rather important because, again, if the polls have historically underestimated Donald Trump, what is a metric that might get at understanding at how popular he may actually be? So let's take a look at the percentage of the country who say that we're on the right track. It's actually a very high percentage when you compare it to some historical numbers. What are we talking about? According to Maris, 45% say that we're on the right track. That's the second highest that Maris has measured since 2009. How about NBC News? 44%. That's the highest since 2004. Wow. The bottom line is the percentage of Americans who say we're on the right track is through the roof. And if you were to compare it to when presidents have historically been reelected, of course, Trump is not constitutionally eligible to run for re-election, but I think it sort of puts it in perspective. 42% of the country says the country is on the right track when the incumbent party is re-elected. And also keep in mind, back when Kamala Harris lost and the Democrats were turned out of power, only about 27 to 28% of the country said the country is on the right track. The bottom line is right now, a much higher percentage of the country says we're on the right track. And finally, Sarah Seidner, I want to put it all in the congressional generic ballot.
What about Congress? No.
What about Congress? Because those are the folks who are up in 2026. And take a look here. The Dems versus the Republicans on the generic congressional ballot. Back in November of 2020, when Democrats won, it was +5 Democrats. Tied in November of 2022, +1 in November of 2024 when Republicans maintain control. And then you look at March of 2025. This number looks a lot more like 2022 or 2024 when Republicans won control of Congress. The bottom line is, yes, Donald Trump's approval rating is lower than compared to a lot of his predecessors, but it's higher than compared to himself. A lot of folks say the country's on the right track, and the generic congressional ballot looks a heck of a lot more like when Republicans win than when Democrats win.
It will be interesting to see if any of what just happened with these leaking of the text plays into it in a later poll. But this is very telling.
This is very telling. At least at this point, Republicans are still in the catbird seat.
And that was a little bit of the political corner. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, the Patriotic Short.
In November 1943, the B-17 Flying Fortress Romance was about to begin its bombing run over Germany when a flight of German Focke-Wulf 190s launched a fierce attack. Enemy fire struck the cockpit, severely wounding both the pilot and co-pilot. The pilot, Captain Charles Ohl, was removed from his seat by Lieutenant Harold Stralser, the plane's navigator who began tending to the unconscious and badly wounded man. Meanwhile, the co-pilot, First Lieutenant Martin Downey, managed to guide the plane towards the target. With the command, "The plane is yours," Romance's bombardier, First Lieutenant George "Pappy" Hines, had control of the aircraft and would soon release the bombs on target. For Pappy, this mission would complete his tour, with a distinction as being the first member of the 381st Bombardment Group to finish up and return home. After success with the bombs away part of the mission, the Romance was once again in the hands of the co-pilot, who was frequently blacking out. Seeing this, Lieutenant Strasser, despite having no flying experience or training in the Flying Fortress, took the controls, alternating between piloting the plane and administering first aid to Downey. All the while, German fighters continued their relentless assault. Strasser's evasive maneuvers were so extreme he feared his actions might leave the rest of the squadron vulnerable. After consulting with Downey during one of his brief moments of consciousness, the two agreed that the Romance had to leave the formation to avoid endangering the entire squadron. Strasser descended and signaled to the rest of the formation that he was breaking away. However, the squadron refused to leave Romance behind. The tail gunner soon reported the rest of the squadron was still in formation with them. Assuming his signal hadn't been understood, Strasser climbed back to altitude, flew level, and repeated the signal. But once again, the squadron wouldn't leave the Romance to fend on its own as a vulnerable straggler. Through incredible determination and skill, Lieutenant Strasser managed to bring Romance and her crew safely back to base. When Lieutenant Strasser later confronted the pilot of the No. 2 bomber, Lieutenant Daniel Haggerty, about why the squadron hadn't continued on without them, Haggerty replied, it was his last mission. He had to get back. If he didn't, none of us would. Thanks to the bravery and teamwork of the men aboard Romance and the entire squadron, Lieutenant George "Pappy" Hines completed his tour and returned home. For his extraordinary actions that day, Lieutenant Harold Strasser was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He was later promoted to captain and survived the war. Harold Strasser passed away on April 4th, 2004 at the age of 83.
And that was the Patriotic Short. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, a little bit of motivation. And that was a little bit of motivation. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of meditation. And that was a little bit of meditation. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Daily Stoic.
We can work anyway. Indeed, how could exile be an obstacle to a person's own cultivation or to attaining virtue when no one has ever been cut off from learning or practicing what is needed by exile? Musonius Rufus, Lectures, 9.37.30 through 31, 9.39.1. Late in his life, after a surgery, Theodore Roosevelt was told he might be confined to a wheelchair for the remainder of his days. With his trademark ebullience, he responded, "All right, I can work that way too." This is how we can respond to even the most disabling turns of fate, by working within whatever room is left. Nothing can prevent us from learning. In fact, difficult situations are often opportunities for their own kinds of learning, even if they're not the kinds of learning we'd have preferred. Musonius Rufus, for his part, was exiled 3 times, twice by Nero and once by Vespasian. But being forcibly expelled from his life and his home didn't impinge on his study of philosophy. In his way, he responded by saying, "All right, I can work that way too." And he did, managing to squeeze in some time between exiles with a student named Epictetus, and thus helping to bring Stoicism to the world.
And that was the Daily Stoic. And now, Bishop Robert Barron.
My favorite movie is a movie called A Man for All Seasons. There's a scene in that movie. Thomas More, this great man, is talking to a young man. He's a recent Cambridge graduate. His name was Richard Rich. Richard Rich is ambitious. He wants a position at court. He knows Thomas More is a prominent, important person, so he's hanging around him, asking for a job. Finally, More says to him, and this is the scene I'm talking about. More says, "Richard, I have a job for you. There's an opening in the local school. They need a teacher." A teacher? Richard Rich says, "He didn't want that." And More tries to cheer him up. "You'd be a good teacher, perhaps even a great one." And then Richard Rich says, "If I were, who would know it? Who will know it?" And More answers back, "Yourself? Your friends? Your pupils? God?" Not a bad public, that. And you see the point Thomas More was trying to make. Young Richard Rich, you should play not for the audience of the world. They're impressed by worldly accomplishment. You should play to the audience of God. In other words, you should live your life in such a way that the cultivation of your soul, your capacity for love, is what matters the most to you.
And that was His Excellency Bishop Robert Barron. And now, the Ayn Rand thought of the day. Quote, "Today, the very motive that draws a man to art, the quest for enjoyment, makes him run from it for his life. He runs to the gray, sunless, meaningless drudgery of his daily routine with nothing to relieve it, nothing to expect or to enjoy. And he soon stops asking the tortured question, is there anything to see tonight? Is there anything to read? Along with art, he gives up his vision of values and forgets that he had ever hoped to find or to achieve them." Unquote. And that was Ayn Rand from the chapter, Our Cultural Value Deprivation, from the book, The Voice of Reason. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now a little bit of gaslighting.
Gaslighting is a type of manipulation that occurs in abusive relationships. It is when the abuser makes the victim question their sense of reality and their sanity. For example, the abuser would do something abusive, like call the victim a bad name. Then the victim would get mad, as any normal person would, and then the abuser would convince the victim that they're just too sensitive. And in the end, the victim would find themselves apologizing to the abuser even though they didn't start the problem in the first place.
Gaslighting.
And that was gaslighting. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, Maria and then Stu.
You didn't have to.
You could have done what you wanted. Final thoughts. Mario Benarosa, real
absolutely.
quick.
Markets gaining strength, recently reclaimed the 200-day moving average. Weather's warming up, and the market will warm up as well.
Cheryl Casoni.
Buy low, sell high, Todd.
Oh, come on, guys. Have a great Tuesday, everybody. We'll see you again tomorrow. Varney and Company picks it up. Stu, take it away.
All right. Good morning, Maria, and good morning, everyone. More positive news on tariffs, and you can thank Fox Business' Edward Lawrence for the story. President Trump says he will give lots of countries breaks on the tariffs he will impose. This adds to the news Monday that industry-specific tariffs, like on automobiles, pharmaceuticals, computer chips, may not be announced on April 2nd. Reciprocal tariffs, yes. Some get breaks. Some industries get at least a brief reprieve. On the market, a big rally Monday on the tariff news. No sell-off today, more tariff news. In fact, we got some small gains, some green. Dow up maybe 70, S&P, what's that? That will be 11 points, NASDAQ about 33. Bitcoin, the latest quote we have is 87,100. Interest rates, well, I'll call it slightly elevated. The 10-year moving up to 4.35. The 2-year is above 4%. You're looking at 4.04 as we speak. And gold, well above $3,000 an ounce, 3,054. All right. Politics. The news is this. Multiple bombs found inside a Tesla showroom in Texas, the same dealership where protests have been taking place. Attorney General Pam Bondi taking these attacks seriously. The Justice Department going after who they call domestic terrorists, who could face long prison sentences if found and convicted. Kash Patel, he'll launch a domestic terror task force. On the show today, ICE takes down 370 criminal migrants in Boston, including murderers and child rapists. Boston is a sanctuary city. The mayor has been protecting known dangerous criminals. Sky-high taxes, burdensome regulation, they do have consequences. People could move. You can see the population shift in future congressional representation. Blue states, California, New York, Illinois, they're losing seats. Red states, Texas, Florida, gaining seats. The bottom line, Republicans are expanding their footprint. Democrats are not. And this week marks the 25th anniversary of the peak of the dot-com bubble. Obvious question, is the big tech AI boom going the same way? We'll see. Today is March 25th, 2025. Varney and...
And there you have it. Nonprofit news now. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now the Byung-Chul Han Corner. The disenchantment of the world means first and foremost that our relationship to the world is reduced to causality. But causality is only one kind of relationship. The hegemony of causality leads to a poverty in world and experience. A magical world is one in which things enter into relations with each other that are not ruled by causal connections, relations in which things exchange intimacies. Causality is a mechanical and external relation. Magical and poetic relationships to the world rest on a deep sympathy that connects humans and things. And that was the Byung-Chul Han Corner from his book, The Crisis of Narration. Back in a minute. Thank you. Law and order.
Needed him to put the defendant in the building, and he did.
The only thing missing was a solo violin.
Well, remind the jury there's a grieving family in Queens and a dead girl who went to Iraq for a noble cause.
Not everyone feels that way.
We deposed a mini Stalin, who tortured and slaughtered hundreds of thousands of his own people, who attacked Kuwait and gassed the Kurds.
So why didn't we go in years ago?
So right there, he makes a mistake. He goes ahead and accepts her premise that not everybody feels that way. She's making an arbitrary claim. She's not lying, but she's not telling the truth either. She's making an arbitrary claim, and she's doing it to bait him into making the argument he's making now so that she can make these other arguments. Why didn't we do it earlier? Why didn't we go into Kuwait or whatever? Okay. What he should have said when she says, the best way to deal with an arbitrary claim is to make a counter arbitrary claim. So she says, not everybody feels that way. And then he should have said, yes, everybody does feel that way, at least everybody except you. So he's making an arbitrary claim too. Now, if she doesn't like that claim, the burden of proof is going to be on her, where it belongs. It also puts her in a position where she's now isolated. Okay? He's making it out to look like she's the only person in America that doesn't feel that way. Back to the show.
And what about the genocides in Rwanda and the Sudan?
How many oil wells does Rwanda have?
There's no oil in Bosnia and Kosovo. We intervene to keep Muslims from being massacred. We go in, we get criticized. We don't go in, we get criticized.
And it usually backfires. We helped the Afghans fight the Russians and they became the Taliban. We went into Iraq against the wishes of the international community and it turns into a quagmire.
When is the last time the international community did anything other than hold our coats? I mean, we're the poster kids for schadenfreude. Until they need us.
I'm just giving you the heads up that your poster girl for patriotism is about to be portrayed as a torturer.
Which establishes motive. This wasn't political. It was payback.
So, again, you see how that played out, where now Arthur Branch, the DA, is now on the defensive. And by the way, this is a discussion between Arthur Branch, the DA, and his two ADAs on this particular case. And so you hear the female, then she just goes to town. As soon as he starts to try to prove that the Iraq war was justified, right, that it was worth doing, then she just goes to town. Really? Well, what about this? Well, what about that? And she starts smothering him with questions, and questions that he's going to have a difficult time answer. But what she's doing is putting the burden of proof on him and following up. And that's the way you do it. That's the way you have to treat folks like this, is you turn the burden of proof on them, and then they get to answer the questions. Such as maybe, what about Pearl Harbor? What about the Twin Towers? She doesn't mention anything about that. 3,000 Americans dead who were doing nothing but going to work that day. So you can use that as, again, a follow-up point once you tell her, yes, everybody does feel that way, at least everybody except you. Back in a minute. Thank you. Now, on this situation with Donald Trump where he's deporting people and there's a judge that's trying to interfere. Again, and I'm listening to John Cobelt's show right now, and he's got on some guy named Royal Oakes as a contributor, and Royal Oakes was saying, well, you can almost tell how a judge is going to rule by whether or not he has a D or an R after his name, or whether or not who appointed him has a D or an R after his name, and it shouldn't be that way. And he's absolutely correct. It shouldn't be that way. But it is that way because we believe in government rights, that the government has certain rights. And because there is that belief in this country, there are those judges, usually Democrats, that believe that the government has rights and will do whatever they can to enforce those rights, the rights of the government. Whereas Republicans, again, have a tendency to acknowledge only the rights of the individual. So, as long as we're buying into government rights, we're going to continue to have this divide in the country, and the judges will be increasingly doing these balancing tests and asked to balance the rights of the government versus the rights of the individual, when in fact there is no right of the government. The government just has no rights. So this, and again, harms us because, number one, it puts our all of our laws into question. We're supposed to be a nation of laws. And the nice thing about that is you know what you can do, you know what you can't do, just by reading the law. You look at the law and you say, oh, I can't do that. So when they come out with government rights, then it throws everything into question. Now everything is a potentially litigable, if you will, a potential litigation. You can be sued, or there is going to be criminal action based on this fiction of government rights. And as long as we have this going on, we have this confusion, it hurts us because we have then trouble defending ourselves from enemies, both foreign and domestic. So, and the solution is, when the government tries to tell us that we have extra rights, because that's where they get their rights, they tell us that we have the right to be free from various things, free from poverty, free from crime, free from terrorism. And when we buy into that, it sounds good. Well, yeah, that sounds good. I don't want to be subjected to terrorism. Yeah, why not? Because we don't have it as a right. It's not a right. It's an opportunity. We have the opportunity to be free from those things, but we don't have it as a right. And as soon as we buy into it as a right, the government then goes ahead and exercises its rights, so to speak, to make that happen. So they become preemptive, and in so doing, violate our civil rights. No good. Back in a minute. Thank you. And now, the Gospel according to Breaking Bad.
Chapter 10. What does a man do, Walter? The picture for this chapter is of 3 beakers partially filled with liquid, the tools for cooking meth. Growth, decay, transformation. In the Christian tradition, no person can be so evil as to be beyond the infinite grasp of God. Even Walter White can be saved. Even his sins can be expunged. Even his heinous actions can be erased, though their worldly consequences remain. This is an incredibly difficult teaching. One of the defining characteristics of Breaking Bad is the fact that show creator Vince Gilligan intentionally set out to make a TV series where the protagonist undergoes an intense transformation. With few exceptions, most TV shows feature a main cast of characters who rarely change from one season to the next, much less one episode to the next. Breaking Bad shatters that mold by turning a lowly chemistry teacher into one of the most treacherous, conniving, deceitful, murderous, and callous drug dealers the Southwest has ever known. In many ways, Breaking Bad asks one of the same questions central to the Christian faith. Can a person really change? When someone undergoes an intense conversion experience, as depicted in the former chapter, much of their life changes. Walter's change results in him being dragged into a criminal underworld. In contrast, a recent convert to Christianity often sees their life drastically change for the better, especially if they've previously battled some type of addiction. Friends that knew them before their spiritual rebirth may have difficulty believing they've honestly changed. Skeptical at first, these friends may even attempt to drag the recent convert back into their old habits. This cat-and-mouse game gets played out in Breaking Bad as Walter constantly reminds Jesse of his former ways, guilting him into furthering Walter's own cause. Walter's sinful soul can't bear to see his closest friend make any step toward wholeness or goodness. Both of these men are changing, but they're aiming for opposite ends of the moral spectrum. 19th century Christian minister and author George MacDonald could have been talking about Walter and Jesse when he wrote, "There is this difference between the growth of some human beings and that of others. In the one case, it is a continuous dying. In the other, a continuous resurrection." The pilot episode clues us into Gilligan's intentions with the continuously dying Walter White. The words he speaks as he's teaching his chemistry class are telling. Chemistry is the study of matter, but I prefer to see it as the study of change. Now just think about this. Electrons. They change their energy levels. Molecules. Molecules change their bonds. Elements. They combine and change into compounds. Well, that's all of life, right? It's the constant. It's the cycle. It's solution, dissolution, just over and over and over. It is growth, then decay, then transformation. It is fascinating, really. Yet just like the boy and girl students commiserating with each other as Mr. White delivers his impassioned plea on behalf of the art and science of chemistry, we're as oblivious to the full and ominous meaning of his diatribe since we've only known Mr. White for 6 minutes by this point. Knowing what we know now, this short monologue provides fascinating insight into Walter's psyche. More than just providing the practical basis for his future business endeavors, these words lay Walter's cards face up. Instead of viewing the world as it is, as inert, unchanging matter, Walter opts to see it as a world in flux, something he can change and bend according to the whims of his vastly superior intelligence. As he's romanticizing chemistry, Mr. White uses 3 differently colored bottles to cause colorful reactions with a lit Bunsen burner. With the right tools in hand and knowledge in mind, Walter can effect explosive change. Yet, just as quickly as he grins to himself for his chemistry as life soliloquy, we're directly pulled from Mr. White's fascination with his subject and back to the real world that Mr. White lives in, one where his students don't respect him, his wife constantly goads him, and he has to work a second job at a car wash just to make ends meet. This is a defeated man, although we can tell he was once idealistic about his progress through life. If we aren't people like this, we know people who are. Throughout the series opener, Gilligan beats us over the head with Walter's sad, average, grin-and-bear-it life. It is this world that Walter wants to change. When he finally receives his cancer diagnosis, a catalytic life moment that represents decay in all its terror, the audience finally relents. We are now firmly on Walter's side, wanting to see his life change for the better. However, this is just the beginning of a cycle. Over time, our relationship with Walter will also grow, decay, then transform until the cycle starts anew. Gilligan and his writing team play our emotions like yo-yos, constantly toying with our self-identification with Walter White. As the series progresses, we see Walter grow and decay at the same time. His sister-in-law Marie makes readily apparent Walter's motivations for his actions when she says, "Facing death changes a person. It has to, don't you think?" While his morality still seems somewhat intact early on in Season 1, as evidenced by the macabre pros and cons list he makes when deciding on whether or not to kill Crazy 8, every debased action Walter justifies in his mind and consequently commits causes his moral center to decay that much faster. It's as if Walter's morality has a half-life of 1 season. By the end of Season 2, we know that Walter's morality has effectively left the building, as sure as he, quietly, quickly, and deftly left Jessie and Jane's apartment following her overdose. The mild-mannered chemistry teacher who couldn't even control his classroom has now become a monomaniac who knowingly allows Jessie's junkie girlfriend Jane to asphyxiate on her own vomit. But just as Walter White veers down a certain path of destruction, Jesse Pinkman, former dropout junkie, becomes the moral center of the show. As the previous chapter attested, Jesse may be the one person who's actually redeemed by the end. Yet, fleeting moments of possible restoration for Walter occur throughout the series. These instances can make the hopeful viewer believe that Walter may finally be turning the corner, coming to the full realization of the awesome devastation he's caused for so long. Unfortunately, fans of the show know that Walter's doomed. So, if you're anything like me, why do we hope for his redemption? In this world where wrongdoers get punished for their actions, though it may take months or years, why might we hope for the worst one of them all to escape such punishment? Maybe it's because we're Walter White. All hail the king. If you believed in the strict gospel according to Breaking Bad, you'd believe the gospel according to our most pessimistic views of America. Greed is good. Relationships exist to serve my needs. Others cause all my problems. If it ultimately serves my purposes, it's morally okay. Might makes right. Manipulation is acceptable when the ends justify the means. Get what you can while you can. There is no ultimate judgment. But there's a deeper story being told in the Breaking Bad universe, one that's been told 1,000 times before in 1,000 different ways. The plight of Walter White echoes a similar story from the Bible. King David, the man who once killed a giant to defend his people and was described as a man after God's own heart, was also a man who carefully plotted the murder of one of his top army leaders, Uriah. David committed this crime in the hopes of covering up his affair with Uriah's wife, Bathsheba, an affair that resulted in pregnancy. David's conspiracy works, and Uriah dies on the front lines of a battlefield. David marries Bathsheba, and all is well, that is, until the prophet Nathan approaches David. Here's the Bible's retelling of their exchange. When Nathan came to David, he said, "There were 2 men in a certain town, one rich and the other poor. The rich man had a very large number of sheep and cattle, but the poor man had nothing except one little ewe lamb he had bought. He raised it, and it grew up with him and his children. It shared his food, drank from his cup, and even slept in his arms. It was like a daughter to him. Now a traveler came to the rich man, but the rich man refrained from taking one of his own sheep or cattle to prepare a meal for the traveler who had come to him. Instead, he took the ewe lamb that belonged to the poor man and prepared it for the one who had come to him. David burned with anger against the man and said to Nathan, 'As surely as the Lord lives, the man who did this must die. He must pay for that lamb 4 times over, because he did such a thing and had no pity.' Then Nathan said to David, 'You are the man.'" As we well know by now, Walter White is the king of self-justification. Confronted with the ramifications of his actions, Walter capably lies to himself about his direct involvement with the catastrophes that seem to constantly befall those near him. Other people have to die so his empire may expand, or that his family may survive, or that he can continue to live. More often than not, his actions are motivated by all 3 reasons, each vying for importance in Walter's soul. Seldom do we know exactly what he's fighting for. All we know is that Walter White feels wholly justified in his actions, despite the inevitable repercussions they will have for him, his empire, and his family. He may be able to rationalize how his particular manipulations may affect the immediate future, but he cannot know the ultimate outcome of his choices. Such knowledge isn't granted to humans, no matter their intellectual superiority. For Walter White's story to come to a close, he has to be confronted with the brutal reality of his life as it is now. Hank, and likely Jesse too, will be the Nathan to his David, the ones who force Walter to finally look into a mirror for longer than a few seconds. In some form or fashion, Walter's reckoning will occur as he's brought face to face with the incredible amount of devastation he's wrought thus far. Sadly, it may require a death in the family, much like King David lost a son as judgment for his affair with Bathsheba. But before we sit on a throne of judgment pointing fingers at Walter White as the epitome of evil, we must likewise look into a mirror. Everyone has a dark side. The subtle gospel, according to Breaking Bad, is this: we are all Walter White. Broken bad and desperately in need of redemption, but woefully unable to extricate ourselves from the dire circumstances of our lives. Barring some type of outside intervention, we are headed for destruction, and in the end, an honest assessment of our lives would reveal that the sole reason for our undoing is actually ourselves. Early Christian theologian Augustine of Hippo said it well in his Confessions. For what am I to myself without you, but a guide to my own downfall? Coming to terms with our own culpability in the trials and challenges of life is one of the most difficult issues we may face. Tolstoy famously wrote, "Everybody thinks of changing humanity, and nobody thinks of changing himself." To admit, I was wrong, and to face the consequences of one's actions requires an imminently humbled ego, and such an event rarely occurs without a catalytic moment. A death in the family, a broken relationship, a stark reminder of the frailty of life. Being granted the ability to see our own guilt in light of the actions of our lives is both a gift and a curse. We are damned because of our actions, but if we were never made aware of those actions' effects on those around us, we'd never have the opportunity to right our wrongs and claw ourselves toward redemption. You may actually be an otherwise good person, someone who's never even thought about trying crystal meth, a person who'd never sail their co-conspirator down the river in order to save their own skin, or someone who doesn't ponder devious ways to ensure that your drug kingdom keeps expanding, but you are still Walter White, a gleaming name hiding a dark secret. What I discovered is that everyone has a dark side. It might be unrealized, untapped, but if the right buttons are pushed, anyone can become dangerous. Part of defining the gospel necessarily means bringing to the forefront that which would rather remain hidden. Consequently, talking about the gospel necessitates discussing challenging, deep, and hard issues before revealing the reasons why hope still exists despite our soul's conditions. As author Madeleine L'Engle wrote, "Maybe you have to know the darkness before you can appreciate the light." Like Walter, we are dying. Every day of our lives is tragically another day we inch closer toward ceasing to exist in this world. As sure as Walter celebrates his birthdays with pancakes every year, we will come to the end of our days in due time. This is a morbid, foreboding thought, but reality doesn't ask us for our emotional or intellectual assent to its ways. While we can get away with casting our disbelief onto fictional characters, why would you do that, Walter? Don't you love your family? We cannot escape ourselves. We cannot outlast our mortality. Like Walter, we are greedy, whether it's money, time, respect, or something else entirely. We are seldom settled with having enough. Part of the American dream, after all, is the accrual of more and more and more. We buy clothes and toys and gadgets to make us feel better, but they quickly go out of style, necessitating another round of buying. We work 60-hour weeks to bring home as much bacon as possible so that we can feed our needy kids with the same consumerism that feeds us. The cycle of more takes drastic measures to stop. Even when we set measurable objectives of what having enough means and reach those intended goals, it still isn't enough. The feeling of security or safety we thought we'd have once we arrived at amassing a certain amount doesn't occur, causing us to question why we ever needed this much in the first place. Just witness Walter and Skylar in their storage shed full of cash. Though Walter says he's out of the game by that point, who among us believes this perpetual liar? Yet we're so prone to believing the lies we tell ourselves in order to justify our actions that both directly and indirectly hurt those around us. Like Walter, we are bent. Though our egos may not be as epic, it tramples people nonetheless. Our constant thoughts of me may be hidden to the world for the most part, but we know ourselves too well to admit otherwise. We may live by the subtle credo of looking out for number one that plays itself out in highly visible ways. As the center of our own worlds, those in our circles must orbit around us or risk losing our friendship or respect. Our collective bent toward selfishness is the single greatest obstacle we face with regard to our spiritual lives. Without circumstances conspiring against us to remind us of our actual place before an all-powerful God, we would remain proud, haughty, arrogant, and impossible to live with. Like Walter, we are the kings and queens of self-justification. When presented with incontrovertible evidence of our own wrongdoing, we become like children who've been caught disobeying their parents. We will quickly devise a report on the series of events that caused us to act that way, despite glaring evidence to the contrary. In our minds, the story makes absolute sense. We may even believe it to be watertight. But such a story is more our minds deceiving us, attempting to protect us from acknowledging our own complicity in failing to meet our own particular moral standards. Rather than admitting guilt, we often only admit to being carried along by situations and circumstances that naturally would have led anyone to the same outcome. We justify ourselves because our brittle emotional states can't handle the weight of judgment. Like Walter, we only know part of the story. Despite Walter's intellectual prowess, he does not know everything. He still only knows a very limited part of his own story. Human as he is, he only has access to what directly affects him and what he can deduce from the actions and words of others. As the audience, we know far more than Walter does and can almost see how this tragic morality play has to play out. Similarly, we only know part of the story of ourselves. Jeremiah 17:9 says that the heart is deceitful above all things, reiterating the fact that we can't ever truly know ourselves completely. If we can't understand ourselves, how can we expect to fully understand others, or to rightly ascertain their actions as they relate to our lives? Like Walter, our sins erode our souls like a cancer. Without some kind of divine intervention, we suffer sin's effects, and those in our lives suffer the consequences of our sins too. As we commit one white lie, the next lie comes more easily. As we lust after another person or desire to buy another unnecessary gadget, that inner voice of morality gets a little quieter. Sin metastasizes within. It multiplies upon itself with reckless abandon, uncaring of what it takes so long as it eventually takes all. It's a sickness we're all born with, and a disease we have to fight on a daily basis. Just as no one in the world of Breaking Bad can escape Walter's scheming machinations, so too can we not escape the damning effects of sin in our lives. But that's only part of the story. The Gospel, according to Breaking Bad. We have the word gospel, thanks to the Old English Godspell, meaning good news. The Old English term is a word-for-word translation of the Greek word euangelio, from where we get our present-day words for evangelism and evangelist. More likely than not, you've heard these words, though possibly used in a wide range of ways. Depending on a number of variables, the connotations in your mind with the term gospel may range from a knowing nod of grateful affirmation to a dismissive grimace of offense. The word has been misused and abused for millennia. If it helps, consider replacing gospel with good news anytime you read it. So, what's the good news of Breaking Bad? Like Walter, we are human, so we are loved. Within a Christian worldview, all are loved unconditionally because of our creation in the image of God. Yes, God loves even Walter White. The tangible view of this love appears in Walt Jr.'s plaintive pleas for his father's well-being while being interviewed on the nightly news about the website he created to help raise money for his dad's treatments. One could even argue that Walter's eventual downfall is God's love at work, a just God seeing to it that a violent, greedy, arrogant man is held fully accountable for his misdeeds that have hurt so many. Anyone can be loved by God regardless of their actions, but it is a love that has to be acknowledged and accepted. In the most famous parable Jesus ever told, the shocking story of the prodigal son reveals that anyone who humbly turns from their waywardness will be welcomed home with the open arms of a sprinting, all-loving father. Like Walter, we still have time. Though his time is quickly coming to an end and his redemption is less likely than Saul Goodman winning a case in court, Walter could still choose to repent. However, this repentance would come at a very high cost. We know Walter isn't willing to pay. In order to turn away from the life he's created for himself, he'd have to turn himself into the authorities and admit to being at fault for a number of murders, as well as distributing meth on an epic scale. As Walter's sins stack upon each other, it becomes more and more difficult for Walter to ever confess the full extent of his misdeeds. To do so would be to unravel his carefully constructed life that was initially built on the positive foundation of securing his family's future. However, we know that his initial justification for his heinous actions no longer carries the weight it once did. After adopting Heisenberg as a full-time persona, Walter White's motivations changed to what they likely had been even before the show started: money, respect, and prestige. Likewise, by staying within the cycle of sin and guilt, we allow ourselves to build a flimsy house of cards that may topple with the slightest outside provocation. As this tower constructed on top of our own ego gets taller and taller, we become more and more unwilling to be the ones to voluntarily topple it, even if its destruction may ultimately be for our own good. We fear losing ourselves in the process, even if the person we lose is a fake persona. The taller such a tower grows, the harder it is for us to seek redemption, knowing what the costs may be to ourselves. Unless the fall of such a tower results in our death, we still have time to seek such redemption. Like Walter, an impossible sacrifice has been made on our behalf. The sacrificial death of a selfless person has been a narrative trope for ages, from Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities to Eastwood's Gran Torino. I believe that one of the main characters in Breaking Bad will die by series' end, and it will occur as a heroic sacrifice. Either Jesse will be forced to finally and ultimately stand up to Walter in order to protect Walter's family from himself and be killed for his selflessness, or Walter will come to his senses and suffer the full brunt of judgment headed his way, offering himself as a sacrifice for his family. Such a narrative trope exists because of the most well-known story of ultimate sacrifice that's ever circled the globe, that of Jesus. In Christian belief, Jesus willingly offered himself as a sacrifice, the only person capable of fulfilling all the requirements of a holy life. Christians believe that through his sacrifice, all people who believe he is who he said he is, and he does what he says he does, can now seek peace with God. Instead of our sin-sick souls, God sees his son's selfless sacrifice. In the simplest of terms, because he died, we can live. For a man who has difficulty believing in the possibility of heaven's existence, but yearns for the reality of hell as a place where the unjust suffer their just rewards, Vince Gilligan certainly sounds like he might understand the key to the universe. We sat around this table, talking about every possible kind of ending, Gilligan says. Sometimes you start talking really macro, like what kind of responsibility do we have to find a moral in all this? Is this a just universe that he lives in? Or is it a chaotic universe, which is more in keeping with the one we seem to live in? Is there really karma in the world? Or is it just that the mechanisms, the clockwork of the universe is so huge and subtle in its operation that we don't see karma happening? We talk about all that stuff, and then at a certain point you stop and say, let's just tell a good story. As God of the Breaking Bad universe, Vince Gilligan refrains from having his characters verbalize explicit moral statements. He simply desires to tell a good story. Why? Because story is all-encompassing. Story covers morality and chaos and karma and the universe. A good story provides the necessary backdrop for Gilligan to conceivably work out his faith in fear and trembling, and for millions of grateful viewers to come along for the bumpy desert ride. A good story coerces the audience into his world, a place where we're forced to ask ourselves the same questions that must constantly haunt Heisenberg. Am I really this bad? Why can't I stop? How did I get here? How's this going to end? Who am I? In wrestling with such questions, we necessarily arrive at specific moral conclusions about ourselves. How many other shows are able to goad us into such deep theological territory? At its heart, the gospel is a good story told over and over in 1,000 different ways, a repetitive, though wooing answer for the deepest questions of our existence. From the miracle of humanity's creation to our redemption made possible through the sacrifice of the most humble man that ever lived, the good stories of our world will always win the day. They are the stories we can't help but tell because they come from a place deep within. Our good stories are the antidote to our disease, the salve for our wounds, and the hope amidst our fears. In Walter White, we see the judgment that is rightfully due us, and yet we hope that circumstances or God or the universe or something will intervene before it all goes to hell. We hope so because we fear we may share in his same fate. Yet the gospel provides real hope, even in light of the possibility of such a dark ending. The good news is ultimately a good story, even the best story. Through multitudes of stories, the gospel shouts that grace exists, even for the most diabolical of sinners. More than that, this all-encompassing grace has a name: Jesus. In this God-man, justice and love perfectly coexist. As the only arbiter of truth, what Jesus says about you matters more than what anyone else may say, even and especially yourself. The story that he's plotted out for you from time immemorial to the future date of your passing can ultimately be a good story, if only you'll allow it to be so. Fittingly, the first step toward God echoes a line we know so well: say my name.
And that was Chapter 10 of The Gospel According to Breaking Bad, written by Blake Atwood and read by Alex Hyde White. Back in a minute. Thank you. This is Ron, your host, the only true conservative of the United States today, bidding adios to all the butchers, bakers, and candlestick makers out there and reminding you that determinism is a choice.